said, my name is Matt. I work at Phone to Action, and I retitle my talk from working to thinking outside the box with Vue. So a little bit about my background. I just moved to the DC area from Amsterdam, where I was using mostly Laravel and React. So I'm a little bit new to Vue, but I am going to present an interesting use case about how we use Vue at Phone to Action. So I'll start by talking about the product a little bit. One of the challenges that we face as an engineering team because of the product, and then I'll walk through our solution to that challenge. And I'll end by evaluating the pros and cons of this approach, and I have a couple of team members in the audience here so they can chime in on the pros and cons as well if they like. So first, a little bit about the product. Phone to Action is an advocacy and public affairs platform. We work with a lot of corporations, nonprofits, and special interest groups to help make it easy for individuals to contact their legislator. So we do a lot of different things like text messaging, we do email broadcasting, social media campaigns, we do calling, but one of our core products is what you see here on the screen right now, which is kind of like an action center. So what we're able to do is spin up lots of highly customizable websites that our clients can create and customize. They can do all their own branding, and they can change a lot of the aspects of the Action Center. So recently, like in 2018, we decided that one of our core features was to have highly customizable campaigns. So here on the screen, you can see two different types of campaigns, and although with the screenshots they might look the same, it's important to note that these two things are highly different. The arrow campaign is kind of like a form with a bunch of different options and some custom fields as possible as well. And then Convo is more like a quiz or like a Mad Lib situation. So as an engineering team, we recognize that primarily we're doing the same basic actions, but we want the view to appear very differently depending on the situation. So the challenge that this presents to the engineering team is how can we do this in a scalable way? And what if product comes along tomorrow and asks for an entirely different type of campaign? We need to be prepared for that. So that's our main challenge. And the solution that we came up with is Sombra, which is a Vue engine. And what it enables us to do, it's not actually so different than the previous presentation what Evan was saying, because what it enables us to do is have this presentation layer and decouple the JavaScript logic from its implementation. So the implementation is what the user sees, of course, and then how we handle that logic is kind of this engine that sends and receives data to a Laravel backend, APIs, all kinds of other different services, and does the fun stuff. So now I'm going to really talk most of the talk about how Sombra works. So there's two basic delineation of hierarchy. One is that we have templating files, and then we have JavaScript files. And the JavaScript files, that's where the data is computed, and the template files, that's basically how the user will be able to see what is shown on the page. So, like for example here, one thing I want to point out is that the arrow template and the convo template, they have different order in terms of what the components are displayed. Like form fields is different, form submit is in a different place. So this is just an example, like a small example of how the components can be wildly different. And then on the JavaScript file side, this is where we handle like form actions and submission, retrieving data from the Vuex store, stuff like that. So now I'm really going to talk specifically about the form submit component to further understand how this works. And basically, it's a little bit of magic with the naming convention. So a form submit.vue file will find the form submit templating files based off of the campaign that's currently being run. And at first, when I started with the form submit component and working on a small feature for it, I thought that it was unnecessarily complex, because this is all I saw at the beginning, like find legislators. But in reality, there's a lot of different actions, there's a lot of different data that can be displayed depending on different scenarios. So I'd like to talk a little bit about how the form submit button works. Basically, it's got some basic stuff. It can have a style, it can have a click action, it can have binding of an HTML attribute. So these are kind of the templating files that explain how the logic is displayed. And then behind the scenes, there's this form submit.vue button file, and that contains the bulk of the logic. So most of our components are broken into 4 main segments, and these are rather standard, like props, computed, watchers, and methods. So props are how we send data to from the parent components to its children. So campaign design colors is just a very simple prop that helps you understand how we can customize our campaigns. So the customization comes in from the campaign builder, and then we create an object called campaign desired colors, and that just has like a background color and a text. It just has attributes. And then we have a computed property, and this is an example of a computed property. Basically, the general pattern that we follow is we utilize the props in some way, and then we access that computed property later on in the template. So like show submit button is a method that we can call in the template and determine whether or not the submit button should be displayed or if we should display something else. Yeah, this just returns a Boolean. And also we have some watchers. In general, I'm not the biggest fan of watchers, but this is just an example of one that basically, like, if the call is in progress, then we toggle the action load and send them to the next step in the action. So that's relatively simple. We don't really use too many watchers, or at least we try not to. And then methods. Methods are kind of like the meat of each of the components. So this is a method for the form submit component, and they handle fun things like sending data to the backend and receiving responses. So here we have an async await block where we're going to try and take action for the current campaign. And if we receive the correct response from the backend, then we'll move them along to the next step in the campaign. And if not, then we can, of course, catch the error and display an error message on the page. So that's kind of a walkthrough of the form submit component. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about the trade-offs associated with this approach. So quick disclaimer is that I was not actually working at Phone to Action when they implemented this system. So I feel like this gives me kind of a little bit of an outsider's perspective, and I can come into it with a fresh mind. One thing that I would like to point out, though, is that despite whether or not you like this system, it does enable our business to achieve the business goals. And that's really the goal, is that there are a lot of different scenarios where you can use Vue. This is just one of them. And based off of the product that we have, it enables us to do cool things like we had 21 million plus legislator connections in 2018. So that's people contacting their legislator. So as much as there are some cons, like that it doesn't follow the Vue.js single file conventions, that would probably be the biggest drawback for me, because it's a little bit harder to follow the documentation and for new developers to get up to speed. But it does enable us to achieve our business goals, so that's important. And then another thing that I want to point out is that anticipating changes is really difficult when you take this kind of approach, because you don't know really whether something should be in the template or if it should be computed in the JavaScript files. So it's really important to have a strong back and forth between the product, the designer, the engineer, in order to determine, what should be hard-coded, what can we build for in the future. And as an engineer, like, we might think that our job is primarily just to write the code based off the specs that are provided. But I think it's a broader goal of being able to anticipate changes, enables you to architect the system better in order to prevent problems in the future. So yeah, that's pretty much it when it comes to Sombra. I do want to say that we are hiring at Phone Action. We have a lead front-end developer position. We have a back-end engineer, front-end engineer, data engineer, and QA engineer. All those roles are open. So if you're interested in Vue, Laravel, public affairs, and advocacy, come talk to me after. Thanks very much for your time.
Going from one state to another, just one visualization to another visualization, things can get really tedious if you just go straight D3.js. And it actually turns out that in a lot of data visualization shops. So let's say like at Airbnb or Netflix or even Uber, they work a lot with wedding D3 and React. They use React for the actual templating, and they use D3 for just a lot of like the scales and just like what the magic that comes with D3 essentially. So for me to level up, I'm going to have to need to learn some kind of templating library. So naturally that would normally be React. So why am I here at a Vue talk? Why am I trying to learn Vue in the first place? Well, just kind of the real reason is because Sarah Drasner is one of my heroes, and she is a big proponent on Vue. So I was like, well, I'm just going to learn Vue just because of her. Straightforward, that's the reason, right? So I'm kind of like, there's all these frameworks coming out, like the shops I was talking about, like Netflix has some, or the lead data visualization designer at Netflix, his name is Elijah Meeks. He came up with something called Semiotic, which is just a framework that weds the two things, D3 and React. And you have like something called VX from Airbnb. And so here I am, I'm saying, okay, I'm going to throw those things out and just kind of like learn Vue and try to make my own. Right? It's pretty bold. Very far from actually being able to do it, but whatever, we have to start somewhere and I have a goal, so that's cool. So I'm just gonna go ahead and say like, okay, so I don't know Vue, I just know like like some JavaScript, some HTML, some CSS, like that's all I am. I'm at right now. So the thing is, if I need to learn a technology, I need to start with projects. At work, I don't necessarily have a reason to use Vue right off the bat. So right now I'm like, okay, so I need my own personal project to just kind of get my hands dirty and just kind of like test the waters. So I made my own like GitHub landing page, so like my own personal page. And I was like, okay, maybe I should use that as an excuse to just learn the technology. And so this is what I have. This is kind of inspired by like a hello sticker that you'll generally get at some events. Like, hello, my name is whatever. And so I was like, okay, let me actually put this as my landing page, and I'll make this into a component that I could change. You see these little circles around them? These circles kind of control like what's getting showed, what kind of data is going into this like hello, my name is component. So I'll just hover this, hello, my name is Benjamin Ortiz Ulloa, and right here you'll see here's my CV, my CV. But if I hover on this, it's going to change what the information is. And I'm a data designer, or I'm a data engineer, and I'm involved in my community. So that was the reveal. So like, there's another step to this component. Right here, we have like the main screen where I actually want to put information in. If you think about like dashboards or anything like that, this is where the main data visualization is going to be. And in other things, these little circles could be like the controls, like what you want to see, the information you want to put in there in the first place. And so I was like, okay, this is a good place to start. Let me just kind of do some kind of simple hello, not necessarily simple, but just kind of something to play with. I have data, which is essentially the information I'm going to be showing. Like, not necessarily data, but like, what do I actually want to show the user? So I basically say, okay, what I'm going to do is just kind of make a theme. So here I talk about community, here I talk about data viz, here I talk about like complex systems, and here is just talk about data engineering. So like, the next step on this is like, okay, so when I click on these little buttons, I want information to change on like this little hello, my name is thing. So I'm just going to click on this, and now I have like a screen that kind of like goes back and forth, right, left. Here, like just kind of like going through like if you go to some data journalism sites, so if you go to like the New York Times, you'll have certain kind of infographics that are just like click stories. So just click next, click next, click next. Not necessarily clickbait stuff, but like you read this, so you read this line. Let's go next. Let's go next. So this is kind of what I'm trying to imitate here. Yeah. So this is the main goal. And I also have like one more kind of thing. This is just kind of understanding how components work and how I can actually switch data within the components. And I did the same thing with like a CV. So like here's like a similar thing where I just have something like I was applying it for jobs when I was actually making this. So like at the time, I was like, okay, so I could actually have a full CV and just going to be a list of words, and that's going to be obnoxious. Or I can just kind of like compress it down and actually have like a reason to like actually use component in the first place. So here I have like a toggle when you actually kind of click on like, whoops, when you click on the name or like the actual like information, you kind of go, whoops. What am I, okay, what? Sorry, I'm kind of not used to this computer, but yeah, essentially the idea is like once you click on the item in the resume or the CV, you get more information, or you can compress the information. And that's useful also when you actually display information onto a screen. So let's say you actually have the actual visualization, which is a bar plot or a scatter plot or whatever. If you actually want to like put the actual the rows of data on the side, you don't necessarily want to see all the information in the rows. So you can compress, you can actually like extend the rows or kind of compress the rows. That's kind of going to be information that you can put on a side in its own little table. And so that's kind of a valuable skill set in its own right when you come up with actual like dashboard technology. So this is, again, like I said, this is like a way to actually kind of like play around and actually learn Vue. And so I'm just going to go to the rehab or the actual repo. So this was on my GitHub page. So I can't actually use Vue CLI, right? Because I don't actually have a server in the background. I can't necessarily run Node. And I might not need to know Node, but at least as of now, when I go through the tutorials, I see like Vue CLI, I need Node. Not sure how you'd actually do that in the GitHub page, which is just essentially just an HTML page. So what I essentially ended up doing was just kind of getting like oh no, what am I doing wrong? Like, do I just kind of, where do I click to just that one thing, just one,
just anywhere?
Because like
tap, yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So like in GitHub, in the GitHub pages, if you have like just a GitHub repo, you can create something called like a GitHub page, which is essentially just the name of your repo .github.io, and what it looks for is just an index.html or whatever basic HTML. So here's the index.html that would actually be the main the main HTML file that it would load when you actually go to like your GitHub repo .github.io. And again, so I'm not necessarily using import statements here or require statements here. I'm just kind of using a basic like script source equals wherever the file is located, and that's going to be how I actually get access to my components and all that fun stuff. Again, so when it comes to actual working with data visualization, you're normally going to be working with an API that actually kind of like feeds you with data information or with the data that you're going to visualize. But I don't necessarily have a place to store this API, so I'm just kind of like I'm just putting all the information that I'm viewing on my page and just like its own little not JSON file, but like its own little it's not JSON, it's not an object, it's array, just its own little array, because like that's each index in an array kind of represents like a row in a data frame or an Excel file. And so I'm just kind of accessing this as like my little mini like API. This is where I'm actually kind of getting information. This is what the data is going to look like when I actually store it in there. And so like you'll see in here, there's just like text info, like so. If you go back here, this is just like a clicker, right? I just press like this click right here. So here is a component that gives information about like what I'm passionate about, right? So this is talking about like just visualization in general. And in there I have like a different like I'm presenting different information about that visualization like passion that I have. So I just kind of click. That information is kind of stored in here. So this is and I am involved in my community. Well, so that information is stored into this array where I would have like the actual data stored in something called like slides, and each index within the slides array would be the different stepper that I'm going into. And again, like all these components are like still kind of stored in like a component folder. I guess I call it index files here, and then go into components. And I would just generally access this like with a source equals argument. So the so like sorry, like let's go to the actual main thing. So here's So like basically like it starts off in the template with like just a VF statement if it's like mobile or non-mobile, and then it calls something called a component that's called not info mobile, but info computer. So like there's an VF saying like, is this going to mobile? Is this going to my computer? And the info computer, which is kind of give you like that giant like little screen up there. So this is just like a learning project I have, and that's basically all I have to show. So thank you. If you have any advice,
All right, so yeah, I've a developer. I've worked in Vue now probably for about a year, and I'm probably like a lot of people. I've worked in other things, and now I've kind of come to Vue, and now I'm working in Vue. And so this kind of talk comes from watching a talk on React. And so, and I always think it's interesting when you look at a talk in one community to sort of think, how does that sort of apply to what I'm doing here in the community that I happen to be in right now? So, so let's just take a look at, and this is kind of about code reuse in the micro. So I think the two talks, what's been sort of a common theme is how do we reuse code, and that's sort of been in the macro. These are just sort of some specific techniques you can use within individual components to reuse code. So, so here's a component I have. It's this position component. You can see I'm handling the mouse move, and then I handle the mouse move and I store some state about it. And so if you want to see what it looks like here as I move around, you can see the mouse position changing. So then somebody says, you need to write this other trivial component. It's called color. And so, what does the color component do? Well, so let's just change all of those. We'll save that. Color component. Okay, well, anyways, the color component shows color showing up there. But basically what you see here is in between this color component and this position component, I'm doing the same thing. And so I say, well, how do I reuse functionality? Well, I come from an OO background, and so I know, I can reuse functionality by using object inheritance. So I have a pointer, it does A, it's got a little bit of state. I've got a pointer, it does B, I've got a little bit of state. What can I do? I can write this functionality C, and then I can inherit that state into pointer this. I can inherit that state into this other pointer. But what am I basically doing is I'm mutating, what that pointer can do, what that pointer can dispatch to. And so how do I do that in Vue? Because I don't have inheritance. Well, then in Vue, how do I mutate what the pointer can do at runtime is I can use something called a mixin. And so I can rewrite this functionality using this mixin. So now I've got this mouse mixin where I take out, where I'm handling the mouse move, I'm storing that data. And so here in my color now, I can take that code out. And then here in the position, I can take that code out. So let's just take a look at So this should start up now. So position is still working. Let me see if I can get color working. I don't know why color wasn't working. Just refresh the browser. It could be that it's cached, that I had it running before, yeah. So let me see. Position with color. Okay, so now it's working. So there's the color component. Yay, color component works. Anyways, the color component is just a trivial component. It's just, as I move around, it changes the color based upon where the X and Y is. So it's not like a real component or anything. It's just a show. But there you go. So now I've got this functionality, and I've been able to reuse the functionality by using a mixin. So, but kind of what is, it's not really downsides or upsides, but it's like, what have I actually done by using a mixin? And so, as with inheritance, basically that functionality C that I've mixed into my component is just as much a part of my component as the original component. So if I have A, I mix in C. C is just the same as A. And so that's tightly coupled now. So maybe I want to use A by itself. The other thing, too, is now I've got this functionality living over here in this mixin. And maybe I'm not aware of it when I'm debugging this component. There's 10 mixins, and well, where even is this? Where's all this magic state being kept? And then, as well, it's static. It's declared at build time. So when I build it, I have to say inside of my component, these are my mixins. So then I kind of rack my brain and I say, okay, well, what other ways do I know? I know higher order functions. And so what's a higher order function? It's just, here's my function benchmark. It takes a function, and it kind of wraps that function with some functionality, and then executes that function. And so a higher order function is, it can either take a function or it can return a function. And so I say, okay, well, how can I use it? And so in the React community, you'll find that a lot. And in React, they use that same concept for components to say, I'm going to write a higher order component. So what's a higher order component? It's a component that takes a component and can return a component. And the same way you saw with that benchmark functionality, that I'm able to wrap this benchmarking around this function, and the function has no idea that it's being wrapped with this benchmarking functionality. So it's independent of, so I haven't mixed the benchmarking in and it's being tightly coupled in together and that it can't work without benchmarking. Now it's saying, I can work independent of that benchmarking functionality. So let's take a look at that. And so I get in there and it's working. And so what you see here, what I've done here with this higher order component is I've written it with mouse. And so what this component does is it takes a component, it wraps this mouse functionality around it, and then it returns the component from that component. So it's a component wrapped inside of a component, and the mouse is wrapping that. And so what you'll see from my app then is I then just see, I just wrap it with mouse. I take a position in there, and I can do that with a color as well. So I can pass color in, and the colors and the position, they're unaware that they've even been wrapped with this mouse functionality. And I can keep wrapping and wrapping and wrapping. So I can write, so I want to wrap with color, and we'll wrap with color around. And so now you see, I've got color and I've got the mouse functionality. And so I'm able, but again, the position never really even understands that it's being wrapped and being wrapped and being wrapped, But so let's just take a look at what have we got now that we're using these higher order components. Well, we got this loose coupling that we were looking for. So when we had inheritance, we were very tightly coupled, is that C functionality was much as part of me as the A functionality. But now we've got this loose coupling because I'm just being wrapped. I'm unaware that I'm even being wrapped. But we still kind of have this situation where some of our state may be in wrapped components, which may be in wrapped components, which may be in wrapped components. And so it gets kind of hard to kind of track where we're at. And we also have this situation where we're having to do this statically. So you see in where I'm doing this is I'm having to say position with mouth, with color. But now what if I need to change the way I want to compose these things in my render function? I want to be able to do this at runtime because this is all happening at build time. I'm building to say it's always going to be with the mouse. It's always going to be with color. I'm going to wrap that around my position. So let's take a look at, so I kind of scratch my head a little bit again, and I say, what else do I know of? Okay, well, I've got callbacks. And so the nice thing about a callback is, so here I've got a child component, and so it's a child component that takes an A. And we're all kind of in this mindset that our components always take something. Well, instead of taking the A, what I'm going to do is to take a higher order function that calls back. And so I say, hey, you passed me a function that's going to handle A's. And so now I've sort of inverted this relationship between the parent and the child, because now the parent is the one, I'm the child, and I'm producing the A's, I'm not consuming the A's. And you're just passing me a function that's going to handle the A's that I'm going to produce. And so then I say, oh, okay, well, one too many. So I say, okay, well, how can I do that then? And so let's take a look at here. I'm going to rewrite my mouse component to be an actual component. And so what I'm going to do then is I'm going to handle the mouse move, and then I'm going to use a slot there. And you can kind of think of the slot as the callback. So I'm going to handle this little bit of state, and then I'm going to offer it up for somebody else to handle. And then I'm going to rewrite my color component the same way. So this one says, you know what, I take some props, and then I call back with some props. And so then I'm going to finally have my position, which is still the same. But what I think is the neat thing is here now in the parent, is this parent now is handling all these callbacks and then sort of composing in the render function how it wants these things to sort of relate to each other. So here's my mouse, is I handle the callback, where I handle my X and Y. I pass that on to my color, and then I handle the callback. And so you're sort of always used to going the other direction, where you're taking A's and passing them on down, but by taking functions that handle A's, now you sort of inverted that these are all getting called back into the app, which is the parent, and then the parent is using those callbacks to sort of compose how it wants the components to behave. And so, now we're in this situation where our mouse is just handling this little bit of state, our color is handling this little bit of state and passing it on, and then our position is just handling this little bit of state. And so now we're in a situation where instead of having this magic state and we don't know we're having to deal with it all at once, we can sort of deal with it all in these little components at one time. And so what is that? So what does that really say? In Vue, they call it scope slots. In React, it's called a render prop. You probably just know it as a callback. But again, we still have that loosely coupled. We have explicit dependencies, so you can look inside of each little component to see what piece of state are you actually responsible for. So it's not just all over the place. And then it's dynamic, because that composition, as you saw, was happening here in the here in the render function, which the template's going to get to is the render function. So so those are just some sort of ideas for how in the small you can kind of reuse functionality.
Okay, so I'm Thibaud Morel. I'm currently both a freelancer and a game developer. I'm available for hire, by the way. And I've been doing web development since about '95. So I started with like Netscape and IE and all that stuff. And I just started building web pages, and my career kind of has oriented me more towards the back end side of things. And then the last couple of years, I've tried to bring myself back to the front end side of the world, because I find it more interesting these days. So I've been doing a lot of front end dev. I'm also someone who I'm a Python guy. With the back end, I really like understanding stacks like all the way through whenever I touch them. And so the idea when Vue comes up and it shows you these 590 packages and modules that are being used, I don't know what they do, was very stressful to me at first. So I really resisted adopting this kind of JavaScript framework where I couldn't read the source. Like with Backbone and jQuery, I read the source and I understood everything that was going on. There was something very comforting about that to me. So I resisted for this project using React. I started in 2013 to write this code base. And so I wrote it with Backbone initially. And then eventually I decided that I was kind of too embarrassed to ask for any contribution from anyone else for such an old stack. So I was like, I got to upgrade. And then I thought, okay, Vue seems nice. So the project that I'm working on is a multiplayer interactive fiction game. If any of you are familiar with multi-user dungeons, it's a modern iteration of that. And it has a REST interface to do all of the world building side of things, and it has a WebSocket interface to do the actual game playing, the real-time two-way communication. And the data model has a lot of related data entities. So some big ones, you have like the world where something is taking place. You have a zone, and a zone can be like a forest or a city or the cave under the city or whatever is going on. So in zones you have rooms. In rooms you have items that people can pick up, swords and rocks and whatever. And then you have mobs, which stands for mobile, which is anything that's not static. So it's basically like the equivalent of a player character, but it's a monster controlled by an AI. So I have a JavaScript basically world editor to manage all of those worlds, and I've been running into some difficulties and pain points managing it that I want to talk about right now a little bit at a high level, and I want to talk about. Yeah.
Totally up to you.
If it's big enough, I'll stay like this because I'm going to tab in and out a lot. So what I want to try to do is kind of just describe what were some of the issues that I was never able to solve with Backbone, and why could I not solve them, and what is it about Vue that then allowed me to take a stab at it. So in general, whenever you're displaying data within the context of something else, so in my case, it's like there's a room, it belongs to a zone, it belongs to a world, right? If you enter through the world and you click on the zone and then you click on the room, you have this nice navigation pattern along the way in which with each click you can record what people did, and then you can like display information about the zone and about the world, and you can kind of give context to the room. But what happens if you want to load that middle component first, straight by the URL, right? You don't want to navigate, you just want to, you send a link to someone who's working with you, and you're like, I'm working on this room, I need your help, I'm sending you this. How do you then load like inside out? And so that then like your zone and your world information kind of come with you. That's very difficult to do with sort of the old JavaScript frameworks. And then the other one, if you have components that are independent of each other in terms of REST calls, managing the asynchronicity of when these calls come back at different times, they took different lengths, you're not guaranteed to know that really the first one came back before the second one and the second one came, and vice versa. How do you manage all of that? So what I want to do is I want to show you, this is the world editor, this is production, this is live right now. And I want to kind of talk about what are some of the problems with this that I've been struggling with. So the first one is, if I refresh, you're going to see that first the list of rooms showed up, and then the zones kind of flickered in, and then the map kind of flickered in. And those three things happened. It was 1, 2, and then 3. And they happened at different times because there were different functions, and I didn't use promises or anything like that back then, and I really couldn't deal with all of them coming back at slightly different times. So that was one thing. The other thing is, this is a very flat organization. So I've got all of these entities that I'm interested in, and if I want to edit a loader, which is the concept for how do these monsters and items get loaded into a zone, I would go in here, and then I would kind of have to select my zone up here. If it was loading into a zone down here, I would have to select it here. All of these entities, I kind of have to always go to the base entity and then kind of stitch myself what they refer to. There's no real sense of context, and if I'm building loaders or if I'm working on quests, all of these have to do with the zone that I'm in. And in this, they're not encapsulated within this context. I always have to kind of pull the data that I need. And then the other thing is I have a modal structure for all of this. So all of these entities, these are all generic screens where they all basically do the same thing, which is load something. And then after you've loaded it, give me an ability to go into the details of that thing. And so it's kind of a very one-to-one mapping. I've got one model and I've got one modal, and one belongs to the other. And in here, where I'm editing a monster here, all of this data is this primary data, and then I kind of pushed everything else that was all the related data under this other tab, but it was very arbitrary. I did this because I had a specific structure in the application that I was already kind of being pigeonholed into, sort of. So how did I do this in Backbone? Well, basically, I used a pattern called an event bus a lot, where you have these events and you have codes for the events, and I ended up with over 120 of them across 11 different channels. And for things that you do on your site, for functions, units of functionality in your site, you say, well, when this happens, do this thing. And then in terms of code, I would basically have this one global object called app, and then I would have app.data. App.data would have objects attached to it. And every component that I was working with that was interested in those would listen to them. And then you had this kind of this event happens, and then these changes get propagated and rendered based on who subscribed to them. So that was okay, but how could I do better, and how did Vue help? So I want to show basically what this looks like now in Vue. So this is the same world, And what I've gained now is that this is always the world that I'm in, this is always the zone that I'm in, and this is always the room that I'm in. So I always have this context of what it is that I'm editing. So if I go on the view, the map is going to be narrowed down to only the elements that are relevant for this zone. If I go to the room, it's only going to show me very few things around this room. Let me get to a city here. If I go to a city up here and down here, and I want to look at some of the paths that are defined in them, meaning where the monsters are allowed to go, what path they have to stay. Well, I can do this, and I can create all of these different layers of data on the map because the map is up in the Vuex store. And so essentially there's this like one concept of like data up top that when different endpoints are being called, I can just kind of like update the data in the Vue store, and then I'm just watching for the way that the data should be, not the way that it should respond to events. So Vue gives really, really, really wonderful state management patterns. We're always kind of like struggling with state in these kinds of application because each component has a local state, and we only want that application to have access to the data that it needs and nothing else. But then if you have really interrelated data, if I'm editing like a loader that loads a monster, I need to be able to then go and get the information from that monster. And if it's not made available, it's going to be a problem. I'm going to have to make a REST call. I'm going to have to do something else. So the state management patterns that you gave me were really, really helpful for this. Computed properties are huge. So what I do with the map system now is I define multiple values in the state, and then I have one computed property that is the combination of the values that I'm waiting on. And then as the endpoints resolve, they come and they update and say, I've got this piece of data, I've got this piece of data, I've got this piece of data. And once they're all there, Vue knows that it can do the update because these like ready computed properties are ready, and then it just does the renderings. It's a really, really, really wonderful pattern that is extremely useful. vModel was kind of one of the first magical things that I saw when I read Vue documentation with the input forms two-way bindings. Well, you can use vModels on components too. All you have to do is adopt this pattern that if the prop you're passing down is called value, and if the event you're emitting back up is called input, all of a sudden now your component is a two-way component that can be bound to by a parent component. And so you always have this problem when you have nested components that you are passing down the state data down, 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 and down. And if you want to not use an event bus, then you have to keep passing it down. With vModel, it gives you a very, very, very clean way of saying just keep passing this data down until the component that I'm interested in. And then when the bottom component starts updating it, the inputs will cascade up too. So then you have a very clean state mapping, which is very, very helpful. In general, Vue has really helped me change. When I started with Vue, I put V on everywhere. I was looking for these events. I'm doing this, now let me do this in response. And the more I used it, the more I started relying on VIF instead, where I didn't worry about how something happened. I just worried about the way that the thing should look, and then let Vue decide how it should be rendered based on these kind of rules that I defined. I found Vue to be very pragmatic. A lot of the templating engines that I used with Backbone was Mustache, which was logicless, so it was an incredible upgrade for me to be able to actually have proper for loops in templates. And then all of the this $$ accessors are incredibly practical, and you always kind of have the data that you need wherever you are, which is really, really handy. So Vuex, I've talked about it a little bit already. There's this, we want our components to be isolated, but then we want them to have the data that they need. So what Vuex allows you to do is it creates, essentially, it's like this pattern of the data attribute that's globally accessible, but it puts some rules and constraints on you to prevent you from hurting yourself. And at first, it's frustrating because you say, okay, I want to edit this thing, so now I've got to write an action which has to call a mutation, which has to edit the state object, and then I have to name those, and now they're strings, so let me put them in a constants file. And you end up doing 6 things to update a value, and it's annoying at first. But after you have a lot of it, you always know where things came from. It gives a clear kind of path as to how you got to where you are, which is extremely, extremely, extremely helpful. And then if you have points of data that are different, that stay relevant from screen to screen. So when I'm here at the bottom of the city, I'm going to click on the top of it. This zone actually changed, and so did this room, because I changed which zone I was in. So it knew that in the background it had to reload that piece. If I were to do a list of zone and then click one of the zones that is not one of the selected zones, it's going to have to figure out which room to use as the displayed room. So it's going to have to say, okay, what is the center of the zone, and then update. It just updated the room to be something else. I would not have been able to do all this without Vuex, I don't think. This ability to wait for multiple endpoints and then overlay the data on top of each other and just kind of wait for the result to look the way you expected it to is just amazing. The router has been extremely helpful. I had this problem where I could not, we're 12? Okay. I could not, each entity was not uniquely addressable. So within the modals, when I would say like, I would want to send the information for an item for a friend of mine to work on, I could not really send them a URL that went right down to it. Now I can. With this pattern, because this is defined as a route where this layer is the parent and this layer is the bottom, I'm guaranteed that Vue will first load the top, and that all of the data that I have on the bottom that might depend on something on the top is already there. That's fantastic. And then the route parameters being accessible via this $$ route that params everywhere means that I can just pass those down to API calls without necessarily always having to load the object full on from the store, and it saves time, and it's a really, really useful pattern. But then the real killer is when you add those two together, when you do Vue and router together. That is really true magic if you use this Keepalive component that I think Matt talked about earlier. Then it is really, really awesome, and I'm going to try to show you what the gain is from that. Let me see. If I go here, and then I go here, here. One second. Okay. I'm going to loader. Okay. So this defines what loads what. If I start to add like a monster here, I'm going to say, okay, I want to load this item within the output of like this rule or whatever. But then I say, oh, hold on, let me go and see like what this monster does. I forget. I click here. So then it shows me the information of this monster, and I can go and look at that. And I click to the back button. Everything is back to exactly how it was. And that is just incredible, because this happens all the time, that you're working on something, you forget what the reference is, you want to go check it, and usually you have to like open a tab, do this, do this, do that. As long as you use Vue Store and Vue Router, they will have a synergy that will just do this for you for free. And that is quite amazing. So in addition to all the nice patterns that it's given me, that's been very useful. Lastly, when I did this, I decided to do everything at once, and I went up to, I did Vue and TypeScript, and I also changed my code editor. It was very traumatic. I use Visual Studio Code now. But TypeScript has proved very useful for doing this as well. You end up, when you do a lot of forms and input with a lot of declarative data, and you don't really know, it's very tedious to know which little dictionary key went wrong. And all you have to do is kind of, say when you say your let variable, you say this is let that interface equals this, then it'll tell you if something is wrong. That's fantastic. It helps you evaluate the impact of your changes. So when I started forms, they could only edit things. And then when I went, I was like, oh, well, they need to be able to add things too. And when that happens, the prop can be null, right? So then I changed the TypeScript definition to entity or null, and then highlighted in red all the issues in my code from going to this edit to this add mode because of this like strong typing benefit, which scared me a lot as a Python developer initially, but worked out very well. Downside, when I saw TypeScript, I was like, oh, I'm going to use inheritance because it's class-based. Can't do that. Vue does not support it, so composition is great. We already covered it. And then I won't cover the last point. It's fine. And that's it. Thank you.
So hi, I'm Evan again. If you can't hear me for any reason, just let me know during this. I know we're not supposed to do Q&A because we want to keep it short, but I want to make sure you guys can. So my topic is on the page structure APIs and dynamic components. It's not so much technically Vue-specific implementation. I think you can do this in other frameworks, although I'm not as familiar with other frameworks. It's more methodological in terms of a really cool thing we're doing at work that Vue it works really well with Vue, in particular with dynamic components. So this is something that you may be able to do at your own offices or in your own projects. There's many ways to implement it, so we'll get started. Maybe we won't. Oh, here we go. So what is a dynamic component? A dynamic component is a special generic Vue component that can morph into other components. It's like a superhero component, and accepts the name of a registered component or a component's options object. And so you use this special syntax of is, and then you can use the special syntax of is, and then a property or a string to determine what that component is going to be. Have people used this component in Vue before? Can I get a show of hands? Show fast. Okay, great. That's awesome. That's super cool. So this will be new to some of you. I think other frameworks have something similar, although I'm not 100% sure. But this dynamic component is particularly useful in the context of the example that they use is tabbing. So you can go from something that looks like this, a container element. I'm losing. You can go from something like this, which has like a container element with buttons that slide between tabs and sort of the normal way of handling methods and data in Vue in order to switch between different states. And then you sort of, let's say you have, for some reason, 8 tabs. It can be a little bit repetitive to write out these 8 tabs and then map them to sort of data properties. It's kind of tiring. To something that looks a little bit more like this. You have an array or an array of objects, and then you're iterating over them and you're rendering them using this component, this generic dynamic component. This is a working example via Chris Fritz. So you can see here we have a button, a v4, where we're iterating over these tabs, and we're using this generic component, which is right here, to reference a property of the current tab and sort of create the component. You can see here, really simply, this is Chris Fritz's present little JS fiddle. Very, very simple. So taken with that, it's this generic component, this dynamic component, is particularly exciting to me because we had a challenge at Politico, which was that we wanted the server to provide a payload that would determine the page structure. So raise your hand if you're familiar with the term headless CMS. Okay, cool. So a headless CMS is essentially a means of, essentially an API that allows you to do all the cool things with a CMS, create pages, create layouts, without necessarily the overhead of a UI if you don't want one. Sometimes they do have them, but it's a really flexible way of basically creating pages. And we wanted to do something like that with our backend team. We wanted the backend team to provide a payload. We wanted the front end team to be able to handle that payload and render dynamic and exciting pages for our users. And if the backend changes the payload for some reason, they want to put a module here, they want to put a module there, the front end needs to respond to that. It can't just fail or not render or give some sort of error to the user. So given a JSON structure that might look like this, where we have this large containers object that contains a type that has slots, and those slots have modules. You can see how this sort of resembles the literal physical layout of a page, a container into slots, into modules for those slots. For example, let's say we have a module that's type turtle pictures. I love turtles, so they're turtle pictures. We're provided data for that particular module. We have a write rail that has its own modules, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We have a footer even. We might expect to see something that looks like this on the page. A Vue component called Turtle Gallery that has certain data associated with it, a byline, a calendar, org info in the footer, et cetera, et cetera. How do we get to that point without just explicitly having to create a bunch of different components and then kind of brittly map them to a page that we expect it to be? That wouldn't necessarily work because if the payload changes again, things aren't going to work properly. So this is where the generic component comes into play. We wanted the ability to add or change the module layout composition without causing major headaches. And one way we can do this is with dynamic components. So we're going to take a look at some code. First of all, this is sort of my crappy page. And we're going to come back to this. We'll look at the code and we'll come back to this a little bit. The first thing we have, the first thing I did in creating this code example, and you can actually follow along if you want, my GitHub, which is github.com/EvanJSanderson. It'll be the first thing on the list. Let's say we have data that looks somewhat like this. Is this too big or too small? Is everyone able to see this okay? Yeah, we're looking good. Great. So let's say we have an object and we have a page 1 to page 2 to page 3, for example. We'll look at page 1 to start off with. It's a 2-column page. It has 2 slots, main content and a sidebar. You can kind of see that in our example here. Main content here, a sidebar here. It has a series of modules in each of those slots. So starting off with, we look at our app. This is where we're the sort of container for our entire experience. We're going to just, in the created hook, we're just going to set the page config to that page 1, to that object that has all these slots in its containers. And you can see our first component, our first generic component is right here. And we set that to the type. Now, you'll notice it's not quite so magical as you can just set. It's not quite so magical that you can just set it and forget it. You do need to import the element itself. If it's not there, you're going to get a rendering error inside the console. But you can see we have a 2-column page. And this 2-column page maps to this type. So because Vue is so lovely, it allows you to convert kebab case into camel case and vice versa. And so this 2-column page is directly mapped to this type here. And you could see at some point we could have many different types of pages. We could have a 3-column page, we could have a footer header page, we could have any kind of a tab page, whatever you want. And diving further into our slots, this 2-column page has 2, in the page element, there are 2 slots. The first of which is the main content, again, represented by this, the sidebar represented by this. And those particular elements themselves have modules. And we iterate over those modules here inside the v4. We define what they are with this magical is property. We give them their modules, which could be any number of modules. And we define a key. We have a series of actual modules themselves. Now, these are the most specific elements. This is where we actually get into real specificity. These things have, they accept sort of a data property, and that data property decides like what they will do. So if it's a byline, it might be the name of the person who is the byline. If it's image gallery, it might be an API endpoint that you're pointing to inside of this component, and you may have some state action in there to get to make a call to an API. So in the interest of time, I want to show this kind of in action. So we have these 3 modules. We have the byline, we have the image gallery, which is just, each of these accepts a data prop. Each of these uses the data prop in a specific way. That's the most specific element is those modules. The slots, the second most specific, all the way up to the page, which is pretty generic. So given that we have a page 1, I've also created a page 2. Page 2 also is a 2-column page. Again, you could extend this example out further and further. It could be a 3-column, et cetera, et cetera. So what would happen, let's say in the example, I'm at Politico and the backend team decides to change the payload. They want to move slots around. They want to move modules around inside of slots. They want to move slots around. They want to change the page. So we can mimic that in this little silly example by just changing this line to 2. And you can see our front-end app will change. So now our sidebar is on the left. The modules are slightly different. We have the byline down here, and we have the save items here. And if we change it to page 3, you can see, once again, we've got 2 sidebars. So because of if we had explicitly set these Vue components inside of a page, which is, I'm not saying that that's not the correct implementation for certain use cases. That's absolutely the correct way to do this. There are definite downsides to this. But it allows you, if you have a kind of a page structure API mindset, this generic component allows you to do things like this without having to worry about, now, there is a right way, at least at Politico, of building these pages. We wouldn't want really this image gallery in the sidebar. We really are, almost 99% of the time we want it in the main content. But it allows us to change these modules without things breaking. It gives us some flexibility instead of the brittleness of explicitly setting Vue components on a page. think that's all I have for you now. One thing I do want to mention that's important about the generic component if you decide to use it, there's a Keepalive Wrapper. It looks a little bit like this. Keep alive. And that Keepalive Wrapper means that when coming back, let's say you, for a tab component, for example, each time you move between those tabs, each time that component we switch between those components, the component is re-rendering. It's calling all of its hooks. The Keepalive wrapper says don't re-render. Just keep the state of that whatever that component is. Keep the state of it. You don't need to re-render each time. Sometimes you'll want to re-render that tab. Sometimes you may want to make an API request, for example, each time you click on the tab. But sometimes you may just want to keep the state of the tab as is without having to worry about this, firing 10 or 12 API requests on a page each time a user loads a page and is tabbing around. I would love to take questions right now. That's all I have.
Questions at the end.
Questions at the end.
So we'll do questions after all.
Where can people find the repo?
The repo for this little sample thing is at okay.
We get on all of these.
Okay. Yeah, let's do that. That's much easier. Thanks, everyone.